Hi there, welcome back. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's begin. The wind howled over the cold waters of the North Sea, carrying the cries of seagulls and the distant toll of church bells. The year was 1588, and England stood at the precipice of destiny. Its shores, battered by the tides of history, had long been contested by invaders from Roman legions to Norman conquerors. But now a new chapter was about to begin, one that would transform a small island nation into the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. It began not with conquest, but with survival. In the summer of that fateful year, the Spanish Armada, a fleet of 130 ships, set sail from Iberia, its mission clear: to crush the English and restore Catholic rule. King Philip II of Spain, ruler of a vast empire that stretched across the Americas, believed England's Queen Elizabeth I to be a heretic, a pretender on a stolen throne. His fleet was the mightiest force the world had known, an unstoppable juggernaut that would surely bring England to its knees. But the English had their own advantages. Theirs was a kingdom built on the sea, a land of merchants, sailors, and explorers who knew how to ride the tempests. As the Spanish fleet approached, Sir Francis Drake and his men launched a daring nighttime assault, setting fire to their own ships and sending them blazing into the heart of the Armada. Chaos erupted among the Spanish ranks, and as a storm swept in from the Atlantic, the mighty fleet was torn apart, driven against the jagged rocks of Scotland and Ireland. Against all odds, England had prevailed. The defeat of the Armada was not just a military victory, it was a statement to the world. The English had proven that they could stand against the greatest power of the age, and in doing so, they had earned something more valuable than gold or land: ambition. From that moment on, England's gaze turned outward. The seas, once a barrier, became a bridge. The merchants of London and Bristol saw opportunity in the unexplored corners of the world. The crown, once content to rule its own island, now dreamed of dominion over lands far beyond its borders. This was the true beginning of the British Empire, a dream born of fire, storm, and the unyielding will to survive. And so, the ships set sail. To Africa, where traders sought gold and slaves; to the New World, where adventurers carved out settlements in the wilderness; to India, where the riches of the Mughal Empire promised wealth beyond measure. The empire was not yet an empire, but the seeds had been sown. The rise of Britain had begun. The scent of salt and spices filled the air as the docks of London bustled with activity. The River Thames, thick with merchant vessels, had become a highway of ambition, carrying men and goods to lands beyond the horizon. England, once a modest kingdom bound by its island borders, was now reaching out with hungry hands. The Spanish and Portuguese had shown the way. Vast fortunes lay across the seas, waiting for those bold enough to seize them. It was not kings or generals who led the next great expansion of English power, but merchants. In 1600, under the rule of Queen Elizabeth I, a group of traders gathered in a candlelit hall and made history. They formed the East India Company, a private enterprise with the power to trade, negotiate, and, if necessary, wage war. With a stroke of the quill, England had created something unique, a corporation that would, in time, build an empire. The East India Company's first ventures were tentative. Their ships, laden with wool and tin, reached the bustling ports of India, where the wealth of the Mughal Empire gleamed in the sun. Silk, spices, tea, these were treasures beyond imagining. But they were not alone. The Dutch and the Portuguese had already established trading posts, and competition was fierce. Deals were struck, bribes exchanged, and sometimes blood was spilled. Yet it was not only India that called. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of conquest was unfolding. In 1607, A group of English settlers, financed by the Virginia Company, landed on the shores of North America. They named their new settlement Jamestown, after King James I. It was a desperate gamble. The New World was a place of untamed wilderness, of native tribes who saw the settlers as invaders, of harsh winters that claimed lives like a silent predator. But those who survived held on, driven by the dream of land and wealth. Tobacco became their salvation. The plant, introduced to Europe by the Spanish, proved more valuable than gold. It turned struggling colonies into profitable enterprises, drawing more settlers, more merchants, and more ships. By the mid-1600s, the English controlled a string of colonies along the North American coast, from Massachusetts in the north to Virginia in the south. But with expansion came conflict. The native tribes who had once tolerated the settlers soon realized the true cost of England's hunger. Wars broke out, brutal and unrelenting. The English, backed by guns and steel, pushed ever forward, displacing those who had lived on the land for centuries. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, English buccaneers roamed the seas, preying on Spanish treasure ships. The island of Barbados, colonized in 1627, became the crown jewel of England's Caribbean holdings. Sugar plantations, worked by enslaved Africans, turned it into a paradise for the rich and a hell for the thousands in chains. The trade in human lives became inseparable from the empire's rise, feeding its wealth and fueling its expansion. By the mid-1600s, England was no longer just a kingdom. It was a force that stretched across the oceans, its power built on commerce, conflict, and the relentless pursuit of wealth. The merchants had led the way, but the crown was watching closely. And soon, the empire would need more than just traders. It would need soldiers. The thunder of cannon fire echoed across the English Channel, shaking the very foundations of Europe. The year was 1651, and England was in turmoil. Civil war had torn the nation apart, pitting king against parliament, monarchists against republicans. The execution of King Charles I in 1649 had sent shockwaves through Europe. The idea of a kingdom without a king was unthinkable. But England had done the unthinkable, and in doing so, it had begun forging a new path, one that would reshape its empire. At the heart of this transformation was Oliver Cromwell, the ruthless general who had led the parliamentary forces to victory. He saw England not just as a nation, but as the center of a greater Protestant dominion. Under his leadership, the island of Ireland, a long-contested land, was brought to its knees. The Irish rebellion had threatened English rule, but Cromwell's response was merciless. His armies swept across the countryside, crushing resistance and seizing land. Thousands were killed, and even more were displaced. The conquest of Ireland was complete, and with it, England had taken another step toward empire. But the struggle for supremacy was not confined to Britain's borders. Across the seas, the Dutch had become England's fiercest rival. The Dutch Republic, with its powerful navy and vast trading networks, stood in the way of English ambitions. The two nations clashed in a brutal series of conflicts known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars. The battles raged from the North Sea to the Caribbean, with both sides fighting for control of trade routes and colonies. By the end of these wars, England had secured a decisive prize, New Amsterdam, a Dutch settlement in North America. In 1664, English warships sailed into its harbor, and without firing a shot, the Dutch surrendered. The city was renamed New York in honor of the Duke of York, the king's brother. This was more than just a territorial gain. It was a sign of England's growing dominance. The empire was expanding, and the world was taking notice. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, sugar plantations flourished under English control. Islands like Jamaica, seized from the Spanish in 1655, became the backbone of a brutal economy driven by slavery, Thousands of Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands, shipped across the Atlantic in chains, and sold into a life of relentless toil. The empire's wealth was built on their suffering, a dark shadow that would loom over Britain for centuries. As the 17th century drew to a close, the English monarchy had been restored under King Charles II, but the spirit of expansion remained unchanged. The empire was no longer just an idea, it was a reality stretching across the Americas, Africa, and the Caribbean. Yet this was only the beginning. The next century would see England rise even higher, its ambitions colliding with powerful enemies, France, Spain, and the mighty empires of Asia. The British Empire had claimed its place on the world stage, but to rule the world, it would have to fight for it. The dawn of the 18th century found Britain standing at the crossroads of power and peril. Across the world, mighty empires jostled for supremacy. Spain still clung to its vast American territories. The Dutch ruled the seas with their formidable merchant fleets, and France, led by its ambitious monarchs, sought to expand its dominion. Britain, still growing in strength, could not afford to remain passive. The empire would rise, but only through fire and steel. The struggle for dominance erupted into a global conflict, the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714. At stake was more than just European politics. It was a battle for empire. When the childless King Charles II of Spain died, the question of his successor threw Europe into chaos. France's Louis XIV, the Sun King, sought to place his grandson on the Spanish throne, threatening to unite the two most powerful Catholic nations. Britain, allied with the Dutch and the Holy Roman Empire, could not allow this. The war raged across continents. In Europe, the Duke of Marlborough led British forces to stunning victories at Blenheim, Ramillies, and Oudenarde, proving that Britain could stand toe-to-toe with the might of France. But beyond the battlefield, another war was unfolding, one that would shape the future of the empire. In the Americas and the Caribbean, British and French colonies became battlegrounds. British fleets raided French settlements, capturing key islands and disrupting their trade networks. In Canada, British forces, alongside their indigenous allies, clashed with the French in brutal skirmishes. The war was costly, but by its end, Britain emerged stronger. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, redrew the map of the empire. Britain gained strategic territories, Gibraltar, a fortress that would secure control over the Mediterranean, and Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, strengthening its grip on North America. But perhaps the most crucial victory came not in land, but in trade. The treaty granted Britain the asiento, the exclusive right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. It was a dark triumph, one that fueled Britain's economic expansion, but deepened its entanglement in the Atlantic slave trade. As Britain's power grew, so did its ambitions. The Royal Navy, once a mere defense force, now became the beating heart of the empire. Merchant ships, escorted by warships, carried goods, people, and power across the seas. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the tobacco fields of Virginia, the trading posts of Africa, all became interconnected in a vast commercial web. Yet, Britain's greatest prize still lay ahead. Across the Indian Ocean, in the jewel-laden courts of the Mughal Empire, a new battlefield was emerging. The British East India Company, once a mere trading enterprise, had begun to weave itself into the fabric of Indian politics. Its officers, merchants turned warriors, understood that to control trade, one must control the land. As the Mughal Empire weakened under internal strife, the British saw their chance. They were not yet conquerors, but soon they would be. The British Empire was no longer just an island nation reaching outward. It was an empire of war, trade, and ambition, its eyes fixed on the riches of the world. The battles were far from over, and the greatest conflicts were yet to come. The year was 1757, and the sun had begun its slow descent over the vast subcontinent of India. The Mughal Empire, once a towering force that stretched from the Deccan Plateau to the Himalayas, was crumbling. Weak leadership, infighting, and the rise of powerful regional kingdoms had fractured the empire. The time was ripe for foreign powers to stake their claims. For Britain, the opportunity was not to be missed. At the forefront of Britain's ambitions in India was the British East India Company, an enterprise born of trade, but now teetering on the edge of becoming an imperial force in its own right. With a private army, vast wealth, and political influence, the company was more than just a trading entity. It was a state within a state. In 1757, it would change the course of history. The Battle of Plassey, fought on the banks of the Hooghly River in Bengal, was to be the defining moment. The British, under the leadership of Robert Clive, faced the mighty forces of Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Clive's forces, bolstered by a handful of Indian allies, achieved a stunning victory. The turning point came when betrayal within the Nawab's ranks allowed the British to rout his army. With the victory, Clive gained control of the rich province of Bengal, a territory that would fuel the British Empire's expansion for decades to come. Bengal was not just a political prize, it was a treasure trove. The region's vast agricultural wealth, its opium, its textiles, and its untapped resources all lay at Britain's feet. Bengal became the heart of British India, a province that would serve as the economic engine for the empire's rise. But the cost of this conquest was steep. The exploitation of Bengal's resources and its people would spark resentment and lead to uprisings. Yet, for Britain, the prize was worth the cost. Following Plassey, the East India Company expanded its influence, gradually bringing more of India under British control. The Mughal emperor, once the undisputed ruler of the subcontinent, became a mere figurehead, while British officials, many of them former traders, held real power. The company's private army grew in size and strength, ready to suppress any resistance that arose. But Britain's conquest of India was not without its challenges. The Marathas, a powerful confederation of kingdoms in western India, posed a serious threat to British ambitions. In the early 1800s, they rose in defiance of British rule, launching a series of wars that would continue for decades. Despite their bravery and military prowess, the Marathas were no match for the relentless strategy of British forces. By 1818, the Maratha Empire had been defeated, and Britain's control over India seemed all but assured. As the 19th century unfolded, the British East India Company's influence only grew. Its wealth was unrivaled, and its ability to shape Indian politics was unmatched. The company's presence in India was so pervasive that it was said to be a state within a state. But its dominance was not without consequences. The people of India, from peasants to princes, began to feel the weight of British rule. The economic drain, the exploitation of resources, and the introduction of foreign systems began to sow the seeds of discontent. In 1857, that discontent boiled over into the Indian Rebellion, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny. Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, who had served in the East India Company's army, rose up against their British officers. The rebellion spread across northern India, as entire regions sought to throw off British control. It was a brutal and bloody conflict, one that left thousands dead on both sides. But despite the ferocity of the rebellion, the British were unyielding. The mutiny was crushed, and the consequences were severe. The British government, shocked by the rebellion's scale, took direct control of India from the East India Company. The Crown had now assumed command, and the era of company rule came to an end. India was officially a part of the British Empire. The Raj, as it came to be known, would last for nearly a century, during which time Britain would continue to exploit India's vast resources. Yet, as the years passed, the foundations of the empire would begin to shake. The seeds of independence had been planted, and they would one day grow into a movement that would change the course of history. But for now, the British Empire stood at its height. The sun never set on its holdings, and the wealth of the world seemed to flow into London's coffers. It was an empire built on ambition, war, and exploitation, and its influence would stretch far beyond the Indian subcontinent. By the mid-19th century, the British Empire was a colossal entity, its reach stretching from the vast plains of India to the wilds of Canada, from the coasts of Africa to the islands of the Pacific. The term, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," became a mantra, encapsulating the sheer scale of Britain's global influence. This empire, once born of ambition and commerce, had become the dominant force in the world, and its expansion showed no signs of slowing down. In Africa, the scramble for territory was in full swing. European powers, driven by the desire for land, resources, and influence, raced to carve up the continent. Britain, with its naval superiority and established trading routes, led the charge. In 1815, following the defeat of Napoleon, Britain was left unchallenged in its global pursuits. The Royal Navy, the largest and most powerful in the world, ensured that the British could not only protect their vast empire, but also expand it further. The discovery of valuable resources, gold, diamonds, and rubber, sparked an even greater interest in Africa. In the late 19th century, Cecil Rhodes, an ambitious British businessman, spearheaded efforts to expand British control in southern Africa. He founded the British South Africa Company and played a central role in the colonization of Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe, and Zambia. Rhodes believed fervently in British superiority and envisioned an empire stretching from the Cape of Good Hope to Cairo, a dream that would come to symbolize the British imperial vision. But Africa was not the only front. The British were increasingly involved in the Pacific, where they established colonies in Australia, New Zealand, and various islands. The Australian gold rush of the 1850s led to a massive influx of settlers, transforming the continent into a vital part of the empire. New Zealand, with its fertile lands and strategic location, was another prize added to the British crown. The British had also begun to consolidate their power in the Pacific and the Caribbean, securing control over key islands that served as naval bases, coaling stations, and sources of raw materials. The once small and insignificant colonies had grown into a network of strategic outposts. Each new acquisition was not just a territory gain, but a piece of the grand imperial puzzle, a testament to the reach of Britain's ambitions. In the here Middle East, Britain's influence was beginning to take shape as well. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, became a critical artery for trade between Europe and Asia. By 1882, Britain had effectively taken control of Egypt, a vital link between Europe and India. The Indian Ocean now became a British-controlled highway, connecting colonies, trade routes, and military outposts, ensuring that the empire's power was as much naval as it was territorial. However, not all of Britain's imperial ventures were as smooth as they seemed. While the wealth poured into London from its far-flung colonies, not all of the British Empire's subjects were content. In India, the brutal consequences of the Indian Rebellion, 1857, had given way to deeper resistance movements. The British Raj, established in the aftermath of the rebellion, became increasingly unpopular as the 20th century dawned. The very same wealth that fueled Britain's dominance was also a source of deep resentment among its colonies. The empire's foundations, though seemingly secure, were beginning to crack. Across the globe, the effects of British colonialism were felt in both profound and destructive ways. In the Americas, Canada had grown into a prosperous, autonomous colony, but tensions simmered with the nearby United States. British authorities were forced to adjust their relationship with Canada, ensuring that it remained loyal amid the backdrop of increasing nationalism on the North American continent. The situation in Africa was no less complicated, with British control often contested by local resistance or by rival European powers. The empire's vastness was becoming both a strength and a liability. As it expanded, the cost of managing and defending such a sprawling network of territories grew. The cries of colonized peoples, those who had suffered under British rule, were beginning to be heard more loudly. While Britain continued to reap the benefits of global trade, its dominance was increasingly challenged by other rising powers, notably Germany, France, and the United States. Despite these growing tensions, the British Empire stood unchallenged at its zenith. But as the 20th century loomed on the horizon, the age of empires was nearing its end. The world was changing, and Britain, once the master of the seas, would soon face challenges unlike any it had ever known. The turn of the 20th century marked the beginning of an era of profound change for the British Empire. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain into the world's leading economic and military power. But as the century unfolded, new threats emerged on the global stage. The empire's dominance was being contested not just by other colonial powers, but by the very forces of modernity and nationalism. In Europe, the tensions between the great powers, Britain, Germany, France, and Russia, had been building for decades. Imperial rivalries and the complex web of alliances were leading the world toward conflict. The spark came in 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. The outbreak of World War I would change the course of history, and for Britain, the war would test the very limits of its imperial strength. The British Empire entered the war as part of the Allied powers, fighting alongside France, Russia, and Italy against the Central Powers led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't just British soldiers who fought in this war. The Indian Army, along with troops from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the Empire, swelled Britain's ranks. The war had become a global struggle, one that saw the Empire's far-flung colonies thrust into the conflict. While the British were able to maintain their naval superiority, the war was devastating. The scale of the conflict was like nothing the world had seen before. Millions of soldiers died in the trenches of Europe, and the Empire's resources were drained. Despite its military prowess, Britain could not avoid the cost of a war that lasted for 4 long years, resulting in more than 16 million casualties worldwide. The war also revealed the growing power of new technologies, such as tanks, airplanes, and chemical weapons, which forever altered the nature of warfare. By the war's end in 1918, the world had been reshaped. The Treaty of Versailles redefined the global order, placing the blame for the war on Germany and imposing heavy reparations. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled and Austria-Hungary collapsed. Yet while the old European empires had been weakened, Britain emerged victorious, at least in the short term. The empire's hold on its colonies seemed secure, and the prestige of victory remained. But the war had also planted the seeds of future conflicts. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had ended the Russian Empire and led to the rise of communism, threatening to upend the entire European order. The German Empire, defeated in the war, would soon give rise to a new authoritarian regime under Adolf Hitler, whose ambitions for expansion would set the stage for World War II just 2 decades later. For Britain, the aftermath of World War I revealed the cracks in the imperial facade. The economic cost of the war was enormous, and while the empire still controlled vast territories, it was clear that the British were no longer as dominant as they once were. Nationalist movements began to gain traction in the colonies, demanding independence and self-rule. The Irish War of Independence, 1919-1921, was one of the first signs of trouble. Ireland, a key part of the British Empire for centuries, had long been a source of tension. The war, followed by the Anglo-Irish Treaty, ultimately led to the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922, severing Ireland from the British Empire. This loss was a bitter blow to Britain, signaling that its grip on its colonies was weakening. Across the globe, other nations were beginning to assert their independence. India, where nationalist movements had been simmering for decades, saw the rise of figures like Mahatma Gandhi, whose peaceful campaign for independence was gaining momentum. The Indian National Congress demanded self-rule, and though Britain continued to resist, it became clear that the empire could no longer hold on to India in the same way. At the same time, British colonies in Africa, such as Egypt, Kenya, and South Africa, were also experiencing increasing unrest. In many places, the effects of colonial rule were being questioned. The aftermath of the war left many feeling that the old order was no longer viable. The interwar years, though marked by the often brief respite between World War I and the even more catastrophic World War II, were a time of shifting power dynamics. Britain was struggling to maintain its place in the world, caught between its imperial ambitions and the rise of nationalism in its colonies. The roaring 1920s and the economic devastation of the Great Depression, 1929, further strained Britain's resources, leaving it unable to fully respond to the challenges posed by rising powers like Germany and Japan. While the British Empire still seemed large and powerful, the beginning of the 20th century had proven to be the start of a long, slow decline. The world was changing, and the age of empire, of one nation's dominance over much of the world, was nearing its end. As the world hurtled toward another catastrophic war, Britain found itself in an even more precarious position. World War II, 1939-1945, would not only alter the geopolitical landscape, but would prove to be the final test of the British Empire's strength. The British, having barely recovered from the trauma of World War I, were once again drawn into global conflict, this time against the Axis powers led by Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. The war started with a violent bang as Germany's invasion of Poland set off a chain reaction, plunging Europe into another brutal conflict. Britain, though weakened by the Great Depression and the challenges of maintaining its empire, declared war on Germany alongside France, marking the beginning of a new global struggle. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. The scale of destruction during World War II dwarfed that of the Great War. Bombing raids, trench warfare, and the Holocaust left deep scars across Europe, and the war soon spread to Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. For Britain, the war had both immediate and long-lasting consequences. Winston Churchill, who became Prime Minister in 1940, would lead Britain through some of its darkest days. The Battle of Britain in 1940 saw the Royal Air Force, RAF, fend off a relentless German air assault, preventing an invasion of the British Isles. The Blitz, the Nazi bombing campaign against British cities, devastated London and other major cities, but the British people refused to surrender. The British resilience during these dark times was legendary, and it earned the nation a reputation for defiance. However, despite these heroic efforts, the empire was stretched thin. British resources were already depleted from the Great Depression, and the demands of global war left Britain unable to sustain the vast network of colonies that had once been its pride. Britain found itself relying heavily on its colonies once again, with soldiers, supplies, and resources flowing from the empire to support the war effort. Indian soldiers fought in Africa and Europe, and supplies came from across the British Empire, including Africa, the Caribbean, and Australia. But by the end of the war, Britain's imperial infrastructure was increasingly frayed. The turning point came in 1945. The war, though ending in victory for the Allies, had exacted a heavy toll. Germany was defeated, but the cost for Britain was astronomical. Tens of thousands of British soldiers had died, cities were in ruins, and the economy was crippled by war debts. Meanwhile, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the new global superpowers. Their military and economic might would shape the post-war order, overshadowing the once mighty British Empire. Britain's global influence had dramatically waned. While it still controlled vast colonies, its ability to govern them, protect them, and assert its authority had been seriously diminished. The United States, with its vast industrial power, had become the leader of the Western world, and the Soviet Union's spread of communism posed a direct challenge to the capitalist system that Britain had long championed. Britain found itself caught between these two global giants, unsure of its place in the New World Order, and as the empire was weakening abroad, it was also facing mounting pressure at home. The Labour Party, which had gained power in Britain during the war, had promised social reform and reconstruction. In 1945, Clement Attlee became Prime Minister, and his government embarked on an ambitious program of nationalization, creating the National Health Service and social welfare programs. The economic demands of rebuilding Britain were immense, but the costs of maintaining the empire seemed even more unsustainable. It was during this period that the first major cracks in the empire began to show. India, Britain's most prized colony, had been simmering with demands for independence for years. The rise of nationalist leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru had mobilized millions of Indians in the fight for freedom. The brutality of British rule in India, with policies that often exploited and oppressed the population, had left deep scars. During and after the war, a series of uprisings, protests, and violent clashes intensified the pressure for Indian independence. By 1947, Britain, exhausted by the war and with an empire in decline, could no longer hold on to India. The Indian Independence Act granted India full independence, and the country was partitioned into two new nations, India and Pakistan. The Yatseosi partition was a painful process, resulting in widespread violence, the displacement of millions, and deep-rooted divisions that would echo for generations. This moment marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire. While Britain still held on to colonies in Africa, the Middle East, and the Caribbean, it became clear that its imperial power was unsustainable. The winds of independence were blowing across the world, and former colonies were starting to demand their freedom. Britain's loss of India was not just a geopolitical event, it was a psychological blow. The empire had prided itself on being a global power, but India had been its crown jewel. Without it, Britain's role on the world stage seemed diminished. And while the loss of India was profound, it was only the beginning of a wave of decolonization that would sweep across Africa, the Middle East, and the Caribbean in the decades that followed. The end of the Second World War marked the beginning of the dismantling of the British Empire. As the world turned its attention to rebuilding after the devastation of the war, the British found themselves increasingly unable to maintain the sprawling territories that once defined their global power. The age of imperialism was giving way to the age of nationalism, as colonies around the world began to demand self-determination and independence. The loss of India in 1947 was the most significant blow to the British Empire. With India's independence, Britain's dominance in Asia was effectively over, and the global balance of power shifted. The British Empire, once the largest the world had ever known, began to fragment, its once invincible control over far-flung territories no longer tenable. In Africa, the wave of decolonization started to build momentum in the post-war years. Across the continent, nationalist movements were gaining strength, and former colonies began to push for independence. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah led the first successful campaign for independence in 1957, inspiring other African nations to follow suit. By the 1960s, a wave of independence swept across Africa, with former British colonies like Nigeria, Kenya, and Uganda gaining their freedom. Britain, struggling with the aftermath of the war and a weakened economy, was no longer in a position to hold on to its colonies. The Suez Crisis of 1956, in which Britain, alongside France and Israel, attempted to seize control of the Suez Canal from Egypt, was a pivotal moment in the decline of British power. The United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, opposed the invasion, and the United Nations demanded an immediate ceasefire. The episode exposed the limits of British influence and was a clear indication that the world order was shifting. Britain was no longer the dominant imperial power it once was. In the Middle East, British control over Palestine and Iraq was increasingly untenable. The British mandate in Palestine ended in 1948, leading to the creation of the State of Israel and sparking the Arab-Israeli conflict. Meanwhile, Iraq gained full independence in 1958. British influence in the region continued to diminish as new nationalistic and anti-colonial movements gained strength, especially in the wake of the Suez Crisis. The Caribbean, once a vital part of Britain's economic system, was also beginning to fracture. Jamaica, Trinidad, and Tobago, and other islands gradually gained independence between 1962 and 1966. The British Caribbean, like many other parts of the empire, was no longer willing to remain a colony. The economic and social pressures of the post-war world, coupled with the rise of global movements for civil rights and independence, meant that the old imperial system could not survive. At home, Britain was grappling with its own identity. The empire, once the pride of the nation, was slowly unraveling. Immigration from former colonies, especially from the Caribbean, India, and Pakistan, was changing the social and cultural fabric of Britain. The post-war years saw an influx of workers from former colonies, which contributed to the country's economic recovery but also stirred debates about race, identity, and the future of Britain as a global power. As colonies achieved independence, Britain's imperial role evolved from that of a colonial master to that of a member of a global community. The Commonwealth of Nations, an association of former British colonies, was established in 1949, and while Britain retained close ties with many of its former colonies, these relationships were no longer based on control or domination. The Commonwealth became a forum for cooperation, but the days of the British Empire as a political and economic force were over. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the last vestiges of the British Empire had crumbled. Hong Kong, the final major British colony in Asia, was handed over to China in 1997, marking the symbolic end of the empire's colonial ambitions. The empire, which at its height had spanned the globe, had finally disintegrated, leaving behind a legacy of both achievement and exploitation. However, even as the empire waned, Britain's influence on the world stage did not disappear entirely. Its legacy endured in the form of language, culture, law, and institutions. English became the global language of business, diplomacy, and academia, and British cultural institutions, such as the BBC and the British Museum, continued to shape global culture. The Commonwealth still exists today as a reminder of Britain's former global reach, though it is no longer a tool of imperial control, but a symbol of cooperation among former colonies. The decline of the British Empire was a slow, painful process marked by conflict, resistance, and negotiation. But it was also a transition, a shift from an era of imperial domination to an era of independence, national sovereignty, and the changing dynamics of global power. The British Empire may have ended, but its impact on the world, for better or worse, continues to be felt today. The fall of the British Empire in the 20th century left a complex and enduring legacy that continues to shape the modern world. While the end of colonial rule signified a triumph of self-determination for many nations, it also left behind a web of challenges, contradictions, and opportunities for those formerly under British control, as well as for Britain itself. For the newly independent nations of Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, the end of colonialism was often a moment of hope. But it was also fraught with difficulties. Independence did not necessarily lead to prosperity, and many countries struggled with political instability, economic challenges, and the task of nation-building. Former colonies faced the complex legacy of British rule, arbitrary borders drawn, without regard to ethnic, tribal, or cultural realities. The imposition of foreign political systems and legal structures, and economies heavily dependent on the export of raw materials to the imperial center. In Africa, many nations that gained independence in the 1950s and 1960s struggled with internal divisions, military coups, and a lack of infrastructure. The colonial legacy of divide and rule had often created artificial divisions between ethnic groups, and the imposition of foreign political systems sometimes proved difficult to reconcile with local traditions and governance structures. Countries like Nigeria, Congo, and Kenya experienced violence and political turmoil as they navigated their new identities as independent nations. The British had left behind a legacy of governance, but the questions of how to unite diverse populations and create stable economies were often more complicated than anticipated. In the Caribbean, newly independent nations like Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago faced economic challenges as they tried to transition from colonial economies based on sugar, tobacco, and other agricultural exports. The end of colonial rule also brought about a reevaluation of the legacy of slavery and the diaspora of African, Indian, and indigenous peoples. The Caribbean sought to forge new identities, blending the cultures and traditions of various ethnic groups into unique national cultures. But the economic dependency on Britain and the colonial system often left these nations struggling to achieve full autonomy and economic prosperity. In India, the end of British rule marked a significant turning point, as the newly independent nation embarked on the monumental task of uniting a vast, diverse population into a single democratic state. While India achieved remarkable success in establishing a democracy, the legacy of colonial rule remained. The partition of India and Pakistan left deep scars, leading to decades of conflict and tension between the two countries, which persists to this day. India's post-independence history was shaped by its struggle to overcome poverty, social division, and religious conflict, issues rooted in centuries of colonial rule. Despite the tumultuous aftermath, former colonies eventually carved out their own paths, with some emerging as regional powers or global players. India grew into one of the world's largest economies and a political force, while South Africa eventually overcame apartheid and became a symbol of reconciliation. The rise of nations like Singapore and Hong Kong, once colonies of Britain, showed that former colonies could achieve economic success, though often through a combination of government-led policies and global market integration. For Britain, the end of empire was a profound adjustment. The loss of its colonies was not only an economic and political setback, but it also required the British people to redefine their national identity. The idea of Britain as a global empire had been woven into the country's very fabric, and the transition from empire to a post-imperial world was not an easy one. The British government had to adjust to its reduced role on the world stage, and in the wake of decolonization, Britain focused more on its relationship with Europe and the broader international community. The British identity was reshaped in the post-empire world. Britain sought to maintain its influence through soft power by continuing to project cultural, economic, and political strength, but it was clear that its days as the center of a vast global empire were over. The shift in focus was symbolized by Britain's entry into the European Economic Community, EEC, in 1973, a decision that reflected its attempt to find a new role in a changing global order. However, Britain's membership in the EEC also exposed divisions within the country, culminating in the eventual decision to leave the European Union in 2016, known as Brexit. The end of the British Empire also had significant effects on the global economy. As former colonies gained independence, they sought to assert themselves in the global market. In many cases, this meant transitioning from colonial economic systems focused on raw material extraction to more diversified, self-sustaining economies. However, the legacy of colonialism, economic dependence, debt, and underdevelopment lingered in many regions. Many former colonies struggled to diversify their economies, and the gap between the global South and the global North continued to widen. In the United States, Britain's former colony and now global superpower, the collapse of the British Empire marked a shifting of the baton in global leadership. The United States became the world's preeminent military, political, and economic power in the second half of the 20th century. As the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union unfolded, the world saw a shift in geopolitical power, with Britain often finding itself in the role of an ally to the United States, rather than a rival empire. The British Empire's cultural legacy, however, remains undeniable. The English language, once the tool of imperial control, is now the global lingua franca, spoken by millions across the world in business, academia, and entertainment. British literature, music, cinema, and art have left an indelible mark on global culture. Writers like William Shakespeare, Charles Dickens, and George Orwell continued to be celebrated worldwide, and the British educational system, despite its flaws, has been influential in shaping educational institutions across the globe. While the British Empire's territorial control has ended, its influence is still felt in many parts of the world. Former colonies may have gained independence, but they continue to wrestle with the complex legacies of colonial rule, striving to assert their own identities, cultures, and economic systems in a globalized world. The story of the rise and fall of the British Empire is not just the history of a single nation. It is the history of an interconnected world. Its legacy, both positive and negative, is woven into the fabric of our shared global history, and the echoes of empire are still felt today in politics, economics, and culture.